There comes a moment in every person's life when the world grows quieter, not because there is less noise around them, but because something inside them has shifted. A soft and almost imperceptible change, like the turning of a page in a book you didn't realize you were still reading. This is the beginning of outgrowing someone, not with anger, not with bitterness, not even with a sense of superiority, but with the quiet realization that something once essential has slowly stopped being necessary. It rarely happens in a single day. Growth does not announce itself. It arrives the way dawn does, slowly, in thin streaks of light that appear almost by accident. One morning you wake up, and instead of feeling the familiar pull towards someone's presence, you feel, still, a calm neutrality. Not coldness, but no longer warmth. It is the kind of feeling that tells you the chapter is drifting toward its final paragraphs, even while you still stand in the middle of it. You notice it in the small things first. The conversations that used to flow effortlessly now feel like echoes of earlier versions of yourself. The jokes that once made you laugh now ring hollow, as though they belonged to another lifetime. You listen to the stories they tell, and instead of being drawn in, you find yourself drifting, wondering how it is possible that the person before you hasn't changed at all, while you feel like you've crossed whole oceans in your mind, traveled through thoughts, battles, and realizations they have never witnessed. This is the quiet beginning of outgrowing someone, when your inner world expands beyond the space the relationship once provided. Most people think outgrowing someone is dramatic, a big confrontation, a sudden goodbye, a breaking of ties. But that's rarely how it happens. More often, it is gentle and strangely sad. It is the feeling of trying to speak a new language to someone who still only understands the old one. It is the sensation of returning to a place you once loved, only to discover the ceilings feel lower now, the room smaller, the air heavier. You are not angry at them. You are not resentful. You have simply lived too much, or felt too much, since the version of you that once belonged there. And perhaps the hardest part is this: you don't always know how to explain it, because it's not something they did wrong. It's not something you did wrong. It's simply something that happened, naturally, gradually, the way people grow out of clothes that once fit them perfectly. Some people enter your life at a time when you needed what they offered: companionship, validation, escape, distraction, comfort, adventure. And in that season, they were exactly right for you. But seasons change. And sometimes the people who were once your warmest summer become an autumn that asks you to let the leaves fall. You begin to notice that the conversations have become repetitive. You know their opinions before they voice them. You can predict their responses without needing to ask. You understand their worldview, and you realize that your own has stretched beyond the borders you once shared. You feel a new level of awareness forming inside you, subtle but undeniable, and you understand things you never saw before. You begin to crave silence instead of their noise, peace instead of their chaos, depth instead of their comfort. And you start to realize that the version of you who resonated with them is slowly dissolving, not disappearing, but transforming. Outgrowing someone isn't just about the other person staying the same. It's also about you becoming more of who you are. It happens when you have spent nights thinking about life in ways they have never considered. When you have learned lessons that didn't come up in conversations with them. When your reflections, struggles, heartbreaks, or healings have shaped you into someone who cannot shrink back into the person they remember. There is an emotional maturity that emerges when you evolve, and sometimes the people around you do not evolve with you. You notice that their priorities no longer align with yours. They still chase validation, while you chase meaning. They seek distractions, while you seek clarity. They cling to familiarity, while you seek transformation. And without meaning to, your paths begin to diverge, not visibly, not dramatically, but slowly, the way two rivers separate as they move toward the ocean. The silence between you grows, not because there is animosity, but because there is nothing left that connects your present self to their current world. You feel it deeply, even if you cannot articulate it. The sense that you have become someone different, someone who sees life from a perspective they cannot yet see. And you know, even if you resist it, that staying in this relationship, friendship, or connection means shrinking to fit inside a space you have already outgrown. There is a moment, quiet, private, often late at night, when you finally admit it to yourself. The person you once needed is no longer the person you need now. It doesn't make them bad. It doesn't make you ungrateful. It simply means that growth has taken you somewhere they cannot follow, at least not for now. You begin to feel a soft grief. Not because the person is gone, they're still there, but because your connection to them is fading. You mourn the version of yourself who once found comfort in them. You mourn the memories that feel distant now. You mourn the laughter that no longer echoes the same way. And yet, underneath that grief, there is something else, a quiet clarity. A subtle understanding that this is not the end of something failed, but the completion of something fulfilled. Not every relationship is meant to last a lifetime. Some are meant to be chapters, not the whole book. And outgrowing someone is simply reaching the final pages of that chapter. You feel it when you stop seeking their approval. When their validation no longer feels necessary. When their opinions stop carrying the weight they once did. You begin to rely more on your own inner voice. A voice they may not understand, but one that has become louder, stronger, more honest. You start making decisions based on who you are becoming, not who they remember you to be. Your conversations shift from, "What should I do?" to, "I know what I must do." You stop explaining your growth. You stop apologizing for changing. You stop carrying the guilt of no longer fitting the mold they have placed around you. Because deep down, you know a truth that is both liberating and painful. Some people can only meet you at the level of their own awareness, not yours. And you cannot force someone to grow just because you have. You cannot shrink yourself to stay relatable. You cannot dim your light so they feel more comfortable. You can love them, and still outgrow them. You can appreciate them, and still move forward without them holding the same space in your life. Growth is not cruelty. It is not abandonment. It is simply evolution. And evolution rarely happens in synchrony. You begin to sense this when you feel drained after conversations that once energized you. When you feel misunderstood even though nothing was said outright. When you feel the urge to distance yourself without knowing why. Your intuition becomes louder as your inner self matures. There is a calm realization, the kind that arrives like a gentle wave, that holding on to certain people would mean holding on to an outdated version of yourself. And you are not meant to remain who you used to be. The universe does not allow stagnation. It nudges, it pushes, it whispers, it removes. Sometimes gently, sometimes abruptly. But always with purpose. Always toward expansion. As you evolve, you begin to see clearly who supports your growth and who subconsciously resists it. Who celebrates your healing and who feels threatened by it. Who expands with you and who tries to pull you back into the familiar patterns you fought so hard to break. Outgrowing someone is not a rejection of them, it is an acceptance of yourself. The self you are becoming. The self you are finally listening to. The self you can no longer ignore or silence. And perhaps the most profound realization is this: outgrowing someone does not require you to push them away. Sometimes, simply growing will create the distance naturally. Growth creates separation where sameness once created closeness. And this is the moment, the quiet, undeniable moment, when you acknowledge that life is asking you to rise into a new chapter. Not because the old one was wrong. Not because the old one wasn't meaningful. But because you are no longer the person who began it. You feel it in your bones, in your breath, in your soul. The tenderness of letting go. The ache of becoming. The truth of moving forward. And so you stand at the threshold, looking at the people who once felt like home, realizing that the only true home has always been within you. This is the first sign of outgrowing someone. When the world inside you becomes too vast to fit inside the life you once shared. There comes a moment in every inner journey when growth stops feeling inspiring, and starts feeling unbearably heavy. A moment when you realize that becoming the person you're meant to be will cost you the comfort of who you once were. And with that realization comes a quiet grief, a grief most people never speak about. Because it's not the grief of losing someone through conflict, betrayal, or separation. It's the grief of outgrowing the people who once felt like home. No one warns you about this part. No one prepares you for how much it hurts to realize that the people you once shared your life with no longer share the same pace, the same depth, the same hunger for truth. No one tells you that growing will sometimes feel like leaving. And leaving will sometimes look like breaking your own heart. You begin to notice it slowly, not in grand betrayals, but in small, subtle cracks in the foundation of connection. The conversations that once flowed effortlessly now feel strained. The laughter that used to come naturally now feels rehearsed. The comfort that once felt warm now feels tight, like clothes you've outgrown but keep wearing because you don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. This is the grief of outgrowing familiarity. The ache of realizing the world you built with someone no longer has room for the person you're becoming. It's a soft grief, but it lingers. A quiet ache, but it stays. And it shows up in the most unexpected moments. When you're sitting with someone you used to be close to and suddenly feel like a guest in a place you helped build. When you catch yourself holding back, shrinking your insights, softening your truth, just to make the moment feel familiar again. When you realize you're doing emotional gymnastics to avoid confronting the fact that something precious is no longer alive. It hits you when you laugh at a joke that no longer feels funny. When you agree with a perspective just to keep the peace. When you pretend to be who you were instead of who you are. And somewhere inside, a quiet voice whispers, "This doesn't fit anymore. You don't fit anymore. Your soul has moved farther than your surroundings." But you resist it. You resist because familiar things feel safe. You resist because you don't want to be the one who changed. You resist because change comes with responsibility and loneliness, and no one wants to admit they've outgrown the love, the friendships, the dynamics that once held their world together. You resist because you feel guilty. And you feel guilty because you think growth is somehow a betrayal, that becoming someone new means abandoning who you were, and the people who loved that version of you. But the truth is simpler and sadder. You are not betraying anyone. You are simply evolving beyond an earlier version of yourself. And sometimes, people are attached more to the earlier version of you than they are connected to the evolving one. Not because they are bad. Not because they are unloving. But because they fell in love with who you were at the time, and that version of you made sense in their world. When you begin to change, they don't recognize the shape of your becoming. They can no longer predict your thoughts, your desires, your boundaries. You become unfamiliar to them. And unfamiliarity threatens comfort. And comfort is what most people cling to when life feels uncertain. So they cling to the older version of you, not realizing that you've outgrown its skin. Outgrowing people is not about superiority. It's not about thinking you are better, wiser, or more awakened. It's simply about movement, your soul moving in one direction while theirs remains in another. Some people stay rooted in the familiar. Others feel compelled to walk toward the horizon of who they could be. Neither is wrong. Neither is shameful. But when someone walking cannot remain aligned with someone standing still, distance forms. Quietly. Gradually. And that distance hurts. And here's the part that breaks your heart the most. You still care. You still love them. You still feel tenderness when you think of the memories, the shared laughter, the rituals of closeness that once defined your bond. Nothing inside you wants to walk away. But everything inside you knows you cannot stay. And so you enter the strange space in between. The space where you're physically present but emotionally drifting. The space where your soul feels ahead of your life. The space where you begin to mourn while the relationship still exists. Because some part of you already knows the truth. You are no longer who you were when you built this bond. Sometimes, the hardest part of outgrowing someone is the realization that they cannot follow you where you're going. Not because they don't want to, but because their path, their lessons, their timing, is different from yours. You can't drag someone to their evolution. You can't force them to see through your eyes. You can't shrink yourself to make someone comfortable with your growth. And you can't dim your light just so someone doesn't feel blinded by it. So the grief begins. The quiet mourning. The inner funeral of former versions of yourself, and of the people who loved those versions. You grieve the conversations that no longer hold meaning. You grieve the advice you cannot take anymore. You grieve the emotional patterns you've outgrown but still slip into out of habit. You grieve the identity you once wore like a second skin, the identity that made those connections possible. This grief is tender. It is patient. It is honest. It whispers, "You are allowed to change. You are allowed to move forward. You are allowed to release what no longer grows with you." Yet even as you know this, you'll feel the weight of emotional loyalty, the desire to honor the past, even when the past no longer honors who you are now. But here is the truth that sets you free. Outgrowing people does not erase the love you shared. It only marks the end of the season in which that love could flourish. You can love someone deeply and still outgrow them. You can cherish the memories and still walk your own path. You can carry gratitude in one hand and release in the other. Some people arrive only to teach you how to begin. Some people walk with you only as far as your old self can walk. Some people help you build a chapter they were never meant to finish with you. And that's okay. What matters is not how long they stayed, but how deeply they shaped you while they were there. Growth asks for courage, not just to step into new places, but to step away from the places you've outgrown. It asks for honesty, the kind that admits that comfort isn't the same as alignment, and history isn't the same as a future. It asks for tenderness, the kind you give yourself when you feel guilty for choosing evolution over familiarity. Most of all, growth asks for grief. Because grief is how the heart creates space for what comes next. When you outgrow someone, you're not just letting go of them. You're letting go of who you were with them. You're letting go of the version of you that needed that relationship to feel whole. And you're stepping into a deeper, more courageous version of yourself, one that can walk alone, if needed, without collapsing. There will be moments when you wonder if you made the right choice. Moments when loneliness echoes louder than clarity. Moments when you feel the pull of old emotional habits, the desire to return to something familiar just to soothe the ache of change. But remember this. It is better to walk alone in authenticity than stay with someone in pretense. It is better to honor your evolution than betray it. It is better to grieve the end of a chapter than to force a story that has nowhere left to grow. And one day, quietly, subtly, the grief will soften. The ache will loosen its grip. And you will feel something new rising in its place. A sense of expansion. A sense of emotional maturity. A sense of inner spaciousness that whispers, "You made room. Now something new can enter. New people. New truths. New depths within yourself." Outgrowing people is painful, yes. But it is also sacred. It is the soul's way of clearing the path for the connections aligned with who you're becoming. Not everyone is meant to grow with you, and that's not a failure. That's life unfolding as it should. In the end, outgrowing someone is not the end of love. It is simply the beginning of a deeper love, the love you learn to give yourself when you choose growth over familiarity, and truth over comfort. There comes a moment, subtle, unceremonious, almost unspectacular, when you realize you can no longer fit back into the life you once tried so desperately to preserve. It doesn't arrive with an argument. It doesn't arrive with a dramatic ending. It doesn't even arrive with closure. It arrives in silence. A silence that doesn't accuse, doesn't demand, doesn't negotiate. A silence that simply reveals. You might notice it the first time you try to reconnect with someone you once trusted deeply. You sit across from them, or you text them, or you hear their voice, and something inside you shifts. You become aware of the emotional distance, the unfamiliar weight in the air. Their laugh feels the same, yet it lands differently. Their words sound familiar, but they no longer settle softly in your chest. The cadence of their presence, once comforting, now feels like a rhythm you can't quite follow anymore. You search yourself, wondering what changed. Was it them? Was it you? Was it time? And the hardest truth is usually the simplest. You grew into someone they do not know anymore, someone they were never meant to journey with into the next version of your life. There is grief in that realization. A grief so delicate it feels like bruising beneath the surface. Because outgrowing familiarity doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like walking through the ruins of a place that once sheltered you. You look around, not with resentment, but with a kind of reverence, remembering who you were when you needed these people, these patterns, these places. And then you feel it. You cannot go back to that version of yourself to make things fit again. You cannot shrink yourself to re-enter doors you once walked through. You cannot silence your intuition just to keep conversations flowing. You cannot ignore your growth just to maintain a bond that depends on the older you. It hurts, because familiarity used to feel like love, like grounding, like safety. And now it feels like a room that has become too small to stretch in. You start noticing how often you hold back, not because you're hiding, but because there isn't space for the more expansive, more honest, more aware version of you. You speak and feel misunderstood, not because your words are unclear, but because the lens through which they hear you is outdated. They still see the past version, the one you quietly retired. And you cannot be that person anymore. Not without betraying the life you've worked so hard to grow into. So you sit with the ache of it. The ache of knowing that love does not always expire from anger. Sometimes it expires from evolution. And that is a different kind of heartbreak. The heartbreak of recognizing that you are no longer aligned with what once felt like your entire world. It's not their fault. It's not yours. It's simply the moment when the universe gently closes one chapter so you can finally step into the next without trying to drag the whole story with you. There will be days when nostalgia pulls at you with incredible strength. Days when you wish you could go back, even if just for an hour, to revisit the feeling of belonging that once came so easily. Days when the past feels warmer than the uncertainty of what you're stepping into. But you cannot return, because you are not the same. And the past, even if you walked back into it, would not welcome you the same way, not because it has changed, but because you have. And that difference is irreversible. Eventually, something inside you softens. Not into indifference, but into acceptance. Acceptance that growing sometimes means losing. Acceptance that love doesn't always die, sometimes it transforms into distance. Acceptance that the people who felt like home were meant for specific seasons, not for the entirety of your becoming. And in that acceptance, a new kind of peace begins to form. Quiet, gentle, earned. You begin to understand that outgrowing familiarity is not an ending as much as it is an opening. A clearing. A space being made for what will match you now. For relationships that feel like oxygen rather than obligation, for connections that fit your present self rather than your past compromises. And you realize, the grief is real, but so is the freedom. You close the old door not because you stopped caring, but because you finally started becoming. And the life ahead of you, unknown, unpolished, unpromised, is waiting for someone with the courage to walk forward, not someone trying to squeeze backward into who they once were. This is the moment you finally allow yourself to let go. Not with bitterness. Not with guilt. But with a quiet understanding. You cannot return to the places that no longer hold your future. And that is how you honor your growth. By choosing the path that expands you, even when it means walking away from the ones that once felt like home. There is a moment, after the grieving, after the slow acceptance, after the quiet realization that you can't go back, when the world feels strangely suspended. As if life is holding its breath, watching to see what you will choose next. You stand between two universes. Behind you is the familiar, the versions of you shaped by old expectations, old dynamics, old echoes of belonging. Ahead of you is something uncharted, not necessarily brighter, not necessarily softer, but undeniably more aligned with who you are becoming. And in this in-between, you discover that the greatest courage is often silent. It isn't the loud, cinematic bravery the world romanticizes. It is the small decision, made alone, made without applause, to trust that what you can't yet see is still worth walking toward. This kind of courage begins quietly. It begins with a breath. It begins with the willingness to stop reaching backward each time the past tugs at you. Because the past will tug. Not out of malice, but out of recognition. It knows your name. It knows your habits. It knows the soft places where nostalgia can pull you back into a smaller version of yourself. And some days, that pull feels almost irresistible. You might remember a moment, crystal clear, when life felt simpler, when connection felt effortless, when someone's presence made you believe you had a place in the world. You might feel the warmth of it, the safety of it, the old comfort that once wrapped around you like a familiar blanket. But then you feel the truth underneath those memories. You can love what once held you without needing to return to it. Because as comforting as familiarity can be, it cannot offer you the expansiveness your present self craves. It cannot support the depth, the clarity, the honesty you've fought to embody. It cannot stretch enough to hold the person you're becoming. And so you realize, your future requires more of you than your past ever did. More truth, more presence, more willingness to be uncomfortable in the name of growth. More trust in the unknown than in the memories that once anchored you. And that's where the quiet courage begins, in choosing discomfort over repetition, possibility over nostalgia. You start taking small steps. Not dramatic leaps, just steps. A decision to speak your truth without softening it. A decision to pursue what aligns rather than what reassures. A decision to protect your energy even when it feels selfish. A decision to remain open to people who meet you in the present, not through the lens of your past. Those steps accumulate quietly. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the unfamiliar begins to feel less like a void and more like a horizon. You begin noticing a shift inside yourself. A softening where there used to be fear. An openness where there used to be hesitation. A growing trust in your own ability to navigate new territory without clinging to what once defined your identity. And something else happens, something gentle, something surprising. You begin to meet people who recognize the version of you that you're still learning to inhabit. They don't ask you to shrink. They don't expect you to revert. They meet you where you are, without attachment to who you used to be. These new connections may not feel like home right away. They arrive slowly, forming piece by piece, like foundations being built rather than fantasies being projected. But they feel real. They feel grounded. They feel aligned. And in their presence, you catch glimpses of the life waiting for you on the other side of this transition, a life shaped not by familiarity, but by truth. Then one day, unexpectedly, you notice something remarkable. The ache of what you lost no longer defines you. It becomes a story you carry with tenderness, not a wound you keep reopening. It becomes a part of your history, not the anchor of your identity. It becomes a reminder of how far you've come, not a pull dragging you backward. And in that moment, you realize the purpose hidden beneath the grief. Outgrowing familiarity was never a failure, it was a threshold. A doorway into a version of yourself you never could have met if you had stayed where you were comfortable. The grief was real, yes. The loss was real. But the becoming, that quiet, unglamorous, deeply personal becoming, was real too. And now, standing on the edge of what comes next, you feel something you haven't felt in a long time. A sense of possibility. Not because everything is certain, but because you finally trust yourself enough to walk forward without needing the past to guide you. You realize that courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is moving anyway, with a soft heart, with an honest mind, with a steady breath, trusting that you can build a life that feels like home again, but this time without losing yourself in the process. This is the beginning of that new home. Not a place, not a person, but a version of you who chooses alignment over attachment, authenticity over familiarity. You step forward, quietly, deliberately, and for the first time, the unknown feels less like a threat and more like an invitation. An invitation to become someone you will be proud to return to. There comes a point in every journey of growth where the heaviness begins to loosen, not all at once, not in a dramatic cascade, but in small, almost invisible ways. Ways you don't notice until one day you wake up and feel lighter. Not healed. Not finished. But different. Part of you is still grieving what you've outgrown. But another part, a part that had been silent for so long, begins to whisper again. At first, the whisper feels almost foreign. It speaks of possibility, of individuality, of paths you had once abandoned to stay connected to people you no longer align with. It speaks of the parts of yourself that had been waiting patiently in the background for you to return. This is the slow rebuilding, the quiet return to who you are without the weight of old expectations. It does not rush. It does not demand. It simply invites. You begin noticing small things about yourself again: preferences, instincts, desires that had been muted by years of adjusting yourself to maintain closeness with people you've now outgrown. You begin discovering what you genuinely enjoy, what you genuinely believe, what you genuinely want. Not what was expected of you, not what someone else approved of, not what kept the peace. You start reclaiming the parts of your personality that had been negotiated away in the name of harmony, even when that harmony came at the cost of authenticity. And the rebuilding happens in simple, almost mundane ways. You feel more comfortable in your own company. You speak more honestly in conversations, not harshly, not defensively, but clearly. You set boundaries without feeling guilty or afraid of being misunderstood. You express your needs without shrinking. You take up space without apologizing for it. And slowly, you begin to feel like yourself again, not the version others shaped, but the version you lost while trying to hold on to relationships that weren't meant to last forever. But rebuilding isn't only about rediscovering yourself. It's also about unlearning. Unlearning the fear of being misunderstood. Unlearning the habit of playing small. Unlearning the belief that connection requires sacrifice of identity. Unlearning the idea that you must carry every relationship into your future. When you outgrow people, your heart doesn't only break, it expands. It stretches to hold contradictions, to hold compassion, to hold the bittersweet truth that not everyone who mattered is meant to stay. And this expansion is painful at first, but it becomes liberating. As you rebuild, you begin realizing that growth doesn't take away love, it transforms it. You stop needing others to validate who you are. You no longer feel the urge to explain yourself to those who can't understand your transformation. You stop apologizing for evolving. And in that shift, something remarkable happens. You begin attracting new people, not because you're searching for them, but because you're finally aligned with yourself. People who resonate with your present, not your past. People who value your truth, not your mask. People who don't require shrinking, translating, or justifying. People who speak the same emotional language you've spent years learning. And those relationships grow slowly, gently, without pressure. They don't feel like lightning, they feel like sunrise. Steady, warm, quietly illuminating. Yet the rebuilding also includes solitude, not loneliness, but solitude that nurtures you. You spend time with your own thoughts without feeling the need to escape them. You take yourself on small adventures, learning what brings you alive outside of anyone else's orbit. You create rituals that ground you, not to fill a void, but to celebrate your presence. The loneliness of loss slowly transforms into the solitude of self-reconnection. And then comes another shift, subtle, but profound. You stop comparing your current life to the version you had with the people you outgrew. Not because you forgot them. Not because they didn't matter. But because you understand something now that you didn't before. Not every ending is a failure. Some endings are doorways. Some endings are realignments. Some endings are the universe redirecting you, gently, painfully, necessarily. And as you rebuild your life piece by piece, you discover you are not starting from zero. You are starting from experience, from clarity, from inner strength earned through heartbreak and self-rescue. The person you are becoming is not harder, not colder, not guarded. They are more aware, more intentional, more whole. You realize that outgrowing people doesn't mean you abandon love. It means you refuse to abandon yourself. You stop asking why certain people couldn't come with you. You stop replaying old conversations searching for answers. You stop believing you could have twisted yourself into a shape that made everyone stay. Instead, you begin thanking those transitions, not in a performative way, but in a quiet, inward way, for revealing what you needed in order to evolve. You thank the connections that held you until they couldn't. You thank the endings that taught you resilience. You thank the people who were once home for giving you the courage to build a home within yourself. And as the rebuilding continues, something beautiful happens. The pain that once consumed you becomes merely a chapter. The grief that once defined you becomes a reminder. And the growth that once terrified you becomes the foundation of a life that feels more authentic, more peaceful, more aligned than you ever thought possible. This is the quiet rebirth after the quiet goodbye. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. And as you step into this new version of yourself, you carry with you the understanding that outgrowing people is not the end of connection, it is the beginning of connection that doesn't. There comes a point in every journey of outgrowing where you stop fighting for closeness, not out of bitterness, not out of exhaustion, but out of understanding. Understanding that distance is not always a punishment. Sometimes, it's a sanctuary. Sometimes, it's the only environment where your new self can breathe. This is the part of the journey no one prepares you for. The quiet distance that forms between you and those still rooted in the version of you that no longer exists. It is not dramatic. It is not explosive. It is not a final, fiery confrontation. It's simply space. A gentle, necessary space that grows naturally between who you were and who you're becoming. And at first, this distance feels uncomfortable, like wearing new shoes that haven't molded to your feet yet. You keep wondering if you're supposed to go back, to close the space, to repair something that doesn't feel broken but feels unfamiliar. You replay old memories, not to cling to them, but to understand how things shifted so quietly. You wonder if you could have done something differently, if you could have stayed the same just a little longer, if you could have held on to people without losing yourself. But that is the paradox of growth. You cannot keep everyone and keep evolving at the same time. Not because they are bad. Not because you are better. But because your paths no longer intertwine the way they once did. And so the space remains. Quietly. Softly. Almost politely. You don't announce it. You don't justify it. You don't make it dramatic. You simply allow it. Because one day you realize something powerful. You don't need to close every distance. You don't need to mend every fading connection. You don't need to return to who you were just to make others comfortable. Some distances are protective. Some distances are healing. Some distances are truth. And slowly, you begin to understand that keeping a gentle distance doesn't make you unkind, it makes you honest. Honest with your energy. Honest with your limits. Honest with the spaces in your life that must remain peaceful for you to grow. You learn that the people who once knew you may not understand this new version, and that's okay. They were aligned with a chapter, not the whole book. They were aligned with a moment, not a lifetime. As you grow, the distance gives you perspective. You begin to see things without the fog of familiarity. You see relationships for what they actually were, not what you tried to make them. You see the ways you compromised yourself to stay connected. You see the version of yourself you left behind, the one who tolerated too much, explained too much, gave too much. And from this distance, you begin to reclaim your clarity. You begin to see that not everyone lost in your growth was meant to be kept. Some were meant to be lessons. Some were meant to be stepping stones. Some were meant to be temporary companions on a path you have since outgrown. There is a calm that comes with this realization, a calm that feels like exhaling after holding your breath for years. The distance that once felt painful now feels like relief, like spaciousness, like room to expand. You begin protecting your peace more intentionally. You choose conversations that nourish rather than drain. You give your time to people who reciprocate, not those who only take. You step away from environments that dim your light. You walk toward relationships that feel reciprocal, healthy, grounded. And the most surprising part? You no longer feel guilty for it. Because you understand now that guilt was programmed into you by a version of yourself who equated love with self-abandonment. But the new you, the one who has walked through grief, clarity, distance, and discomfort, knows that protecting your growth is not selfish. It is self-respect. It is self-preservation. It is self-love in its quietest form. And from this place of gentle self-protection, you begin moving differently in the world. You stop over-explaining. You stop chasing. You stop shrinking. You stop holding on to relationships out of fear of being alone. Instead, you become intentional. You choose people who are good for your nervous system. You choose environments where you don't have to perform to feel valued. You choose conversations that leave your spirit calm, not chaotic. You choose relationships where your growth is celebrated, not questioned. And you begin to love the peaceful distance, not because others are far away, but because you are finally close to yourself. The people you outgrew will remain a part of your story, but they no longer define the chapter you're in. The familiarity you mourned becomes a memory. The guilt you carried dissolves into clarity. And the distance you feared becomes the safe space where your next evolution unfolds. This is the quiet, steady, unglamorous truth of growth. Sometimes you must step back in order to step forward. Sometimes you must release in order to receive. Sometimes you must let go of the familiar to make room for the extraordinary. And in that gentle distance, you discover something you never expected. You were never losing people. You were finding yourself. There comes a moment in every journey of outgrowing when grief softens. Not because the loss disappears. Not because the memories fade. But because your heart finally understands something deeper. You were never meant to carry everything with you. Some people were meant to walk only a portion of your path. Some relationships were meant to shape you, not stay with you. Some connections were meant to awaken something inside you, and then release you into the next version of yourself. This is the part of the journey where acceptance becomes tender, gentle, almost sacred. Because now, you begin to bless what you leave behind. It doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't come with fireworks or revelation. It comes softly, like the way morning light enters a dark room. Gradually, quietly, naturally, you begin to understand that not all departures are betrayals. Not all endings are failures. Not all distances are wounds. Some endings are detox. Some departures are liberation. Some distances are protection. Some silences are healing. And when you reach this stage, you no longer look back with resentment. You look back with gratitude. Not gratitude for the pain, but gratitude for the clarity. Gratitude for the growth. Gratitude for the strength that was forged in the very moments you wanted to give up. Gratitude for how far you've traveled from the person you once were. Because when you bless what you leave behind, you claim your freedom. You release the desire to rewrite the past. You release the urge to fix what was never your burden to fix. You release the guilt for choosing yourself. You release the weight of all the versions of you that no longer fit. And something inside you unclenches. Like a fist opening after years of holding too tightly. This is what growth feels like when you stop resisting it. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is not triumphant. It is quiet. It is steady. It is deeply human. You begin to see the people you outgrew not as villains, but as mirrors. Reflecting who you used to be. Reflecting the wounds you've healed. Reflecting the lessons you needed. They taught you where you were still people-pleasing. Where you were still shrinking. Where you were still abandoning yourself for connection. And they also taught you what kind of love you truly deserve. Not conditional. Not convenient. Not half-hearted. Not draining. But a love that grows with you. A love that respects your evolution. A love that doesn't fear your becoming. So you bless them, not because they stayed, but because they shaped you. You bless the moments that broke you, because they opened the door to your strength. You bless the conversations that hurt, because they showed you where you needed boundaries. You bless the silence that grew between you, because it taught you to find your own voice. You bless the distance, because it gave you room to heal. And you bless the version of yourself who clung, who feared, who grieved, because that version carried you to this one. Blessing what you leave behind is not forgetting. It is not minimizing. It is not pretending you were never wounded. It is simply saying, I honor what this connection was. I honor what I learned. I honor who I became. And now, I release it. This is maturity. This is emotional evolution. This is the soft, dignified ending of a chapter you have truly outgrown. And from this quiet acceptance, a new question begins to bloom inside you. If you can bless the past, what beauty might be waiting for you in the future? What friendships will meet the new version of you? What connections will understand your depth without needing you to shrink? What love will fit your soul without negotiation? You are no longer searching for people who feel like home, because you are learning to be at home within yourself. When you bless what you leave behind, you open the door, not for someone else, but for the next era of your own becoming. This is the final stage of outgrowing. Not pain, not guilt, not anger, but grace. Quiet, unconditional, liberating grace. And from this place of grace you step forward. Lighter, clearer, more open to life. Because you finally understand. You did not lose anyone by growing. You simply found yourself. There comes a moment, after all the grieving, after all the unlearning, after all the quiet heartbreak of releasing people you once held close, when something shifts inside you. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but subtly, like the first breath after a long night of dreamless sleep. It is the moment you realize that everything you've lost has guided you back to yourself. For a long time you believed that relationships defined you, that the people you surrounded yourself with were the map of who you were, that losing them meant losing a part of your identity. But standing here now, on the other side of the letting go, the other side of the distance, the other side of the ache, you begin to see the truth. You were not losing yourself. You were shedding what was never truly yours. You were shedding versions of yourself built from fear. You were shedding habits born from pleasing others. You were shedding the weight of expectations that did not belong to you. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you begin to feel the quiet return of your own presence. It feels unfamiliar at first, like meeting someone you knew long ago, but haven't spoken to in years. Someone you forgot you loved. You feel your own thoughts again, your own desires again, your own voice again. The silence, which once felt heavy and hollow, now feels like space. Space to breathe, space to rediscover, space to rebuild. This is the moment when reflection deepens, when you look at your past not with longing, but with understanding. You see the friendships that stayed too long, because you feared being alone. You see the relationships you held together, because you didn't want to disappoint anyone. You see the conversations you avoided, because you didn't want to be the one who changed. And you forgive yourself, gently, fully, completely, because you were doing the best you could, with the self-awareness you had at the time, because your younger self held the world together with hope, and love, and a fragile kind of strength, that only now you realize was strength. Forgiving yourself is part of returning to yourself. Honoring your past is part of returning to yourself. Letting go with grace is part of returning to yourself. You no longer need to reopen old doors to see if they've changed. You no longer need to shrink your truth to fit into someone else's comfort. You no longer need to beg for understanding from people who were never meant to meet the new you. And in this newfound quiet, you learn one of the most profound lessons of outgrowing. Not everyone is meant to understand you. Not everyone is meant to walk with you. Not everyone is meant to stay. And that is not a tragedy. It is a design. A design that gives you room to grow, room to evolve, room to find connections that resonate with who you are becoming, not who you once were. Now, when you look around, you don't see emptiness. You see possibility. You see the potential for people who will meet you with the same depth you've learned to cultivate within yourself. You see the kind of companionship that does not demand your shrinking, and the kind of love that does not punish your evolution. You are no longer waiting for someone to arrive and make sense of your path. You are walking it with clarity, with steadiness, with a quiet power that comes from knowing that every ending guided you back home, back to your intuition, back to your inner truth, back to your own presence. This is what it means to return to yourself. To feel whole even when no one is standing beside you. To feel grounded even when life rearranges itself. To feel peaceful even when the past calls your name. You've learned to outgrow without bitterness. To let go without fear. To walk forward without needing closure. To choose yourself without apology. And so, as this chapter closes, as the final pages of this internal journey settle into silence, you stand as someone different. Someone wiser. Someone softer. Someone stronger. Someone who knows that the people you outgrow were not mistakes. They were stepping stones. And the grief you carried was not punishment. It was transformation. Now you move forward, with a lighter heart, and an open path. Because the version of you who once clung has learned to trust the unfolding, and the version of you who once feared the distance has learned to walk with grace. You outgrew them. You outgrew the past. You outgrew the versions of yourself built from survival. And now, you return to your own soul, with a tenderness you have earned. This is not the end. This is the beginning. The beginning of a life lived in alignment, in clarity, in self-respect, in quiet authenticity. The beginning of a path, where the people who walk beside you are those who can walk with your truth, not your shadow. You have come home to yourself, and there is no greater arrival than that.